Hi, everybody. Welcome back to what would be the main stage if we were here in person. I'm Eileen Neely. I am HAC's Director of Lending, and I am thrilled to introduce the next panel, The Evolution of Rural America's Diversity. So I hope your day has been as great as mine. The workshops have been great. I am loving the virtual conference space. Earlier today, I joined a roundtable where the discussion felt like I was actually at a table with everybody. I would say the hard part of the day has been deciding which workshop to go to. But because of the importance of this next session, you don't have to decide. So you're here, this stands on its own. So I am thrilled to introduce you to one of my favorite people and my friend, Jeff Hayward. Jeff is the Executive Vice President and Chief Administrative Officer at Fannie Mae, and he'll be moderating this next panel, The Evolution of Rural America's Diversity. The past several years have really seen something of a racial reckoning throughout America, including in rural communities. So this panel is both timely and oh so important. The work of applying a racial and equity lens to our work is really tough and requires naming and measuring the results we want to see. It really requires an intentionality toward achieving those results and a willingness to interrogate our own policies and practices that might intentionally or unintentionally lead to disparate results. So a lot of people will say, oh, we have a broken system, and that's what leads to the income gaps and the wealth gaps and the home ownership gap and the health disparities and the incarceration rate disparities. But it's not the system that's broken. The system is perfectly designed to get our current results. So to change the results, which is really what we want to do, we have to take on the hard work of systems change. And that work starts at home. Yes, pun intended. So Jeff's bio is in the conference app, so I won't spend a lot of time on it, but I do want to share with you a little experience that I had with diversity, equity, and inclusion fairly early in my career when I worked at Fannie Mae and I worked for Jeff. So this was back in the 90s and early 2000s. Fannie Mae had a commitment toward having a goal that Fannie Mae would look like America. And it did really well at that goal. I sort of at that time took for granted that that's what workplaces looked like. But it was in the 90s, and a lot of corporate America had diversity programs and goals. And even Dunder Mifflin from The Office had a diversity program. Yeah, some of it was window dressing, and some of it was cringeworthy. But to have a program and actually be intentional about the results that you're trying to achieve are very, very different things. So when I worked at Fannie Mae, I worked for a Black vice president who worked for a Black senior vice president, and that was Jeff, who worked for a Black executive vice president. And that reporting relationship was not that unusual across Fannie Mae because of that intentionality. But then the focus toward that commitment sort of waned, and so did the results. And that's really a lesson that when you make headway toward achieving any sort of improvements in diversity and equity, the work can't stop. Taking our eyes off that ball, things will likely to revert back to where they were before that DEI work began. So recently, Fannie Mae has renewed that commitment toward diversity, equity, inclusion by creating a C-suite position to oversee, among other things, diversity and inclusion, and promoting Jeff Hayward to that position. And Jeff can claim a lot of that credit for Fannie Mae's sort of renewed commitment to diversity, and that's diversity among staff, among customers, and among homeowners. He wasn't satisfied with the status quo, and he really pushed for change from within, and change requires that agitator. And that's why Jeff is the perfect person to lead this next panel. So I'm going to hand it over to Jeff, but Jeff will be joined by Teresa Singleton from the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia and a HAC board member, and Benge Allure from the USDA, and they're going to talk about rural America and its diversity. And here you go. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much for that introduction, Eileen. I really appreciate it. And it warms me inside to think about the time when you were at our company. And it really was a place that others aspired to be. And I hope that we are up to that today in our company. I am thrilled to have the panelists, and I want to get to the very important work that we have to do on this panel today. So I'm going to start. My first question is really a question of level setting. And the question is this, and Banga, this question's for you, and Teresa, this question's for you. What would a diverse, equitable, and inclusive America look like?
I guess I can start. And so first, I just want to thank Hack for the invitation to this plenary session and a very important topic that's one near and dear to my heart, talking about kind of the diverse equity and inclusion as it relates to rural America, because a lot of people just don't see it and ignore it. And there's a lot of erasure of these communities throughout the country. And so for me, a lot of it boils down to value. Do you value these places? Do you value the people in these places? And so, an America that's diverse, equitable, inclusion is a place that where everyone is valued, their place is valued, and so that's what I think about.
Teresa?
So, Jeff, thank you, and thanks to Hack for the invitation to participate. Like Benga, I just really appreciate the opportunity to engage in this conversation. I tend to think about this in diversity, equity, inclusion in very simplistic terms, and I think about it is looking like a society where um, just to put it simply, that someone's race does not determine their life outcomes. So all of the disparities that we see across race and educational outcomes, expectancy, health, those things can no longer be predicted by race. And so when we do the work that's needed to get to the systemic causes that are creating those disparities, that they no longer exist, that's when I think that society will look like in the future for us.
Thank you both for those answers. And I'm going to dig a little deeper in this funnel down. So first, my question was about America. Now my question is about rural, and I want to put it in the rural context. And I'll start by saying, most people, when they debate in the media, diversity, equity, and inclusion, they really portray cities and sometimes exurbs and suburbs as being the place where really the war on diversity, equity, and inclusion has to be won. I think that's different. And so my question is, how do you think about racial equity and inclusion and diversity in the rural context? Because it is specific, it has specific characteristics, and it's very different than the suburbs or these urban places.
So, Jeff, if I can start, I actually I don't tend to think about it as being so very different, and that I think on the interpersonal level and on the individual level, I think that there are a lot of differences. But I think when we're talking about equity, at least for me, I tend to think it's the same conversation that we need to have in urban, rural, and suburban places. That if we want stronger, more resilient economies, if we want people to be successful and to contribute fully to the economy and have great life outcomes, then we need to dismantle the systemic issues that have led to the disparities that are holding back our economy. So I think it's the same conversation, but I do think I don't want to be naive as to the nuances, but I think all too often we get caught up in the differences in this space, when I think if folks could focus on the opportunities that are in front of us, if we do address these issues of equity, we could go a lot further in terms of dismantling the issues and the challenges that we have in front of us.
I agree 100% with what Teresa said. And I'm going to add something that's actually, I think, kind of controversial to what you said, Jeff, because you said that, the war on this has to be won in the suburbs and the cities. And I think it's actually the opposite. The war has to be won in rural places. 'Cause I think it's too late for cities and suburbs. And what I mean by that is that a lot of these cities and suburbs have gotten a lot of investment and they've done well. So you think about your Silicon Valleys, your Austins, your New York, your Bostons. And what they've done with that investment is to exclude communities of color. Rural places are all, I wouldn't say they're all struggling, but they all have different levels of, issues with prosperity. And so there's a lot of opportunity for prosperity throughout the different communities in rural areas. And so what I mean by saying that the war needs to be one of these rural places, that when we start finally investing in these rural communities, we can do it with inclusion and equity in mind, and centering equity. And we have the example of these cities of how not to do it. You think about the highways that went through Black and brown communities. You think about zoning issues and single family housing. And so it's almost like too late for cities and suburbs to do the equity work. Let's use the rural places and then have them be a model for these cities and suburbs.
Wow, that's a really interesting answer. Let me do a follow on to that. So is what essentially you're saying is today's dollars that might be invested in the improvement of rural places could actually go farther than the dollars that went to investing in urban places, because we've got lessons that we've learned. Is that kind of what you're thinking?
That is what I'm thinking, is that you put the money in these rural places and they say, okay, we're investing, but we're centering equity. So all our dollars goes to everybody and it's not exclusionary. And then in 5, 10, 20 years, we see these growth, and we see, because when you invest, we center equity, everyone benefits, and that benefits the whole economy. And then you could point to these places that see, when you center equity, we all do better, as opposed to what you did during the 50s and 60s, or those urban renewal programs in like the 70s and 80s.
So one of the biases against any action in rural communities is that it doesn't scale. So this question is for Teresa. How do you think about, how do you scale in rural so that what you learn in rural Alabama, you can apply to rural Arkansas, or you can apply to rural parts of Illinois? How do you scale things that might be successful?
So Jeff, we've been working here at the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia on doing capacity building around racial equity, where we have built some cohorts where individuals are coming together to solve whatever community problem they've identified. And so we ask communities to identify private sector, public sector, business, education, a whole host of stakeholders to come together and identify a challenge that they're having in their community. And then we put them through a racial equity training where they are really challenging one another to kind of uncover how has race played a role in contributing to this problem, and how can putting equity at the center of the solution help us to solve the problem and move our community forward. And I found that over the past 2 years that we've been doing this, and we've done it in some rural places across our district and in Virginia as well, that grassroots capacity building and peer mentorship and leadership development really can be shared not only across community, but across communities in other communities. And so that they're going and sharing those models with one another. And so they've used this strategy to address problems like small business development, rental housing challenges, and job access. And so we're seeing that just these grassroots community-led conversations where people are sharing with one another the problem identification, capacity building, skill building, really helps them to identify solutions that they're able to share across communities.
So I'm going to ask you, Benga, the same question.
Yeah, and so one of the things, I think I have kind of two ways of looking at this. One, almost asking the scale question is the wrong question. And, sometimes this model of like, well, it needs to scale for it to be valued or useful. Sometimes it may not scale, but that might not matter, because, one of the things with rural places is that it grows, you have population growth, it no longer becomes rural. And so rural places should be able to stay their same size, but still thrive. So part of it is just, scale is not always the solution. But then if you do want to scale and you want to kind of compare, I like, that peer mentoring kind of style that the Federal Reserve of Philadelphia is doing. And so what you want to think about is, when we talk about rural places, we always talk about in a deficit frame. And what you may want to do is actually do an asset frame. And so come up with like, okay, what are the assets of that community? And then how's the capacity? Because different places, rural Alabama is going to be different from rural Illinois. It's going to be different from rural California. but each of those places have a certain set of assets that can be used to create prosperity. And so if you have this capacity building that helps to figure out how to use those assets that are particular to those areas, then that could probably scale, and that you could use across different communities.
I like the way you talk about that, because a lot of times as you listen to urban planners, the first thing they start with, where are the job centers, right? And the job centers is an asset question, right? If you say we're going to start with the job centers, you're actually asking, what are the assets of this community that we can build on? And if there are enough jobs, then there's a whole lot of things you can do around community. So I think this whole thing of starting with assets, I like the way you frame this, starting with assets rather than starting with what the community doesn't have. I think that's a refreshing way to deal with this. And the more I think about what you said here, some of the assets are diverse people.
Yep.
So having people from different places in the world who live in a place, who bring with them the whole set of assets that they bring from wherever they came from, actually could be better for solving problems, for creativity. There could be a whole bunch of things. So I like the way you frame that answer. I think it's a real interesting thing. Now, one of the things in preparing for this call I learned was that there are actually 2,000 rural communities, 2,000 plus, or rural census tracts, where the ethnic minorities are the majority in the rural census tract. I would have never, had I not prepared for this panel, frankly, I didn't know that. Now, maybe I should have, but I didn't know that. Is there something there that says we might be able to make, if you think about these communities and what's in them, are there some central themes that we can really help these communities by virtue of the fact that they're majority in the rural census tract or whatever? Just, does that present any unique opportunities? Question.
So I wouldn't presume to know more about rural demographics than a colleague from USDA, but I would say, I think lifting up the example and the fact that there is quite a bit of diversity in rural America. I think the most recent census is saying, in addition to the statistic that you shared, Jeff, there's about a quarter of the population are people of color in rural America. About a third of rural counties have a population that is at least 25% people of color. And I think that the first message that I would take from that, and a benefit, is that narrative needs to be shared more broadly. I think not understanding and not addressing the diversity that does exist in rural America, and using white and rural as interchangeable, I think it undervalues the diversity that does exist. And I think it also prevents a sharing of resources, strategies, and solutions across places that I think would be very beneficial in growing economies and across urban and rural landscapes. And so we should be doing more. I know the data do not always allow us to speak definitively about rural populations of color, just because you can't dig into the data as well. But I think that it calls for us to use qualitative methods to bring some storytelling and to help us better understand how communities along the Black Belt, the Colonias, the Native American communities, all of these communities have rich assets and an ability to contribute to rural economies in important and incredible ways, and they sometimes get lost in the narrative. So lifting up that narrative, I think, is an important strategy that we need to be mindful of going forward.
I really love what Teresa said about the qualitative methods, that, there's always those data issues, and just, sample size and population size cause a problem. So that's where, leaning on the community, focusing on the local leaders and people there to be able to tell those stories. And one of the more important things is, again, about that narrative that rural equals white or rural equals agriculture, is that what ends up happening is we actually start talking about policy. You don't think, okay, well, if we help farmers, then we're taking care of rural America. When agriculture is only, like, at best 15 to 20%, there's still the 80% that you still have to deal with. And so when you have that narrative that's incorrect, the policy design ends up being incorrect, and you end up missing what could be very useful policies. And it's something that you see a lot throughout these policy debates, where it's like, we're going to focus on this, but it's not, we're not talking about rural people. We're not helping rural places, when it's like, actually, these policies are very important for rural places. So you think about something like the minimum wage, the story is always about cities, but a lot of places in rural would actually need that, people to help with labor and things like that, these policies are not urban focused. They're America focused, both rural and urban. But if you have that incorrect narrative, you're not going to get that story.
Interesting. Okay, I'm going to switch for a second just to the new administration and ask you a couple questions on it. First is, one of the administration's stated priorities is racial and geographic equity. I don't even understand how to frame that. So what do they mean by racial and geographic equity? And specifically, how does that enter into solving for diversity, equity, and inclusion?
It's a very important point, that when you think about one of the things with that, the over 2,000 census tracts that have majority minority communities, is that a lot of these communities are also persistent poverty counties. And so a lot of that has to do with not just the issues of racial equity, but also the lack of geographic equity. And so what I mean by that is that a lot of these communities had a lot of wealth, had a lot of assets, but it was extracted from those communities. That wealth was not able to be maintained in those areas. And so you would have these places you have these firms that would go to these small communities, be the only firm, and then extract wealth from that back to the kind of parent company. And so what you end up having is that's why I think the number is something like 80% of persistently poverty counties are in rural places, because you had wealth extracted from these places. And so when you talk about equity, it's not just about race, but it's also about these geographies where, these places do have assets, but the key is to make sure those assets and the wealth generated, the value generated from those assets are kept in those communities and have everyone in those communities benefit, which is why you have to, state specifically geographic equity too, so that we don't have this extractive methods. And now race is a part of that too, but it's important to differentiate geography from race.
Interesting. Thank you. I know there's lots of discussion about this issue, and that was actually pretty clear. I want to switch to accountability. So after George Floyd, the world decided that it wanted to see a change in America as it relates to DE&I, and actually adding the equity to D&I was actually, in my view, a more recent phenomenon, and really took shape after the George Floyd murder. But the question isn't about kind of our sentiments about what happened and our sentiments about equity in America. It's our accountability. So my question is, how do we keep ourselves, all of us that are responsible, accountable? How do we measure in the best way? How do we communicate about where we succeed and communicate about where we fail and learn where we fail? How do we really enter into, it's not just a discussion, it's about outcomes that change lives, and it's about results. How do we start that discussion, and what are some of the basic things we should do around it? I know it's a long question. I couldn't help myself. You can break it into parts. I'm going to start with you, Teresa, and then I'll go to you, Benga.
So Jeff, and you stopped me. It is a long question, but it's a good one, because I do agree. I think the world's attention turned to issues that our communities have been grappling with for generations, and the rush to do the right thing can sometimes lead us to do surface level things that make us feel good, but don't have the impact that we want. So I think you're dead on with your question, that accountability is important. And I can tell you how we've approached this work, and I'm speaking for the Federal Reserve Bank of Philadelphia, and the work that I'm doing in my unit. There were a couple of things that I wanted to make certain that we did, so that we were doing this work well and right, and that we were holding ourselves accountable. And the first is doing the work, investing in the training that we needed, because diversity, and inclusion are not necessarily equity. And so understanding what equity and meant, and ensuring that not only our senior leaders, but our staff had access to that training and understanding. So do the work. Don't assume you understand without really putting in the work to understand what this is. The second thing is connecting this work to the broader mission of the organization. And so, for us at the Federal Reserve, where we're focused in our department on meeting the needs of underserved communities and building capacity, we took a very economic lens to, we can't do everything, but we can do what we do correctly. And by making certain that we were connecting our equity goals and our equity training to the work of our department and our division, and that's research and convening and capacity building, we were certain that we were going to institutionalize this work. And so I'm here now. I might not be here next year or in 5 years, but that work will continue because we've institutionalized it into our practices. And then, as you said, setting up measurements. What is it? What is it that we want to accomplish? And so, how can we pursue this work in a way that we are really solving for the why? Why are these disparities occurring? Not just doing reports that say unemployment is higher for Blacks, Latinos earn less income, but really digging into the why. And so holding ourselves accountable to fostering research, fostering convenings and initiatives that help us get to that why were critical for us being accountable in this space, and not just checking off we've done this, we've hired, we've accomplished this number of reports, that we're really driving towards impact.
Benga?
So I'm glad Teresa went ahead, because she made a lot of great points that is applicable across a lot of institutions. But the one word I want to kind of point out from her statement was institutionalized. Like, that's what has to happen. Like, this work is like, there's no finish line with this work. This work is ongoing. This work is, at the structures. Eileen, in her great introduction, mentioned that, the system's not broken. The system works. And if we want different results, we have to have a different system. And so some of the things that, this is stuff that we are very concerned about USDA throughout the different mission areas. And, part of it is, you set up key performance indicators. What does the outcomes look like that you want differently? Is that closing disparities? Is that more investment in communities that have had, let's say, zero investment over the last 5 years? What are the indicators that you're going to use to measure? What are going to be interim milestones in between as you get to that point? Performance plans. Everyone has performance plans and things that they do to kind of, to say, okay, have you measured up on what you do? And so you have to put it in every person's performance plan from the top all the way down to every staff member, so that they have the incentives to do this work. The other thing is engagement. So, external stakeholders, people like, are you out doing outreach to these groups? And then, keep doing this outreach like every 6 months or periodically to say, how are we doing? We've tried these things. Is this working? Are there things we need to do differently? But not just external stakeholders, but internal, because people in the workforce, are they being valued? Are there ideas that they have that are we even listening to, staff? And so there's a number of things that you need to do. But at the end of the day, it's about institutionalizing it so that 10 years, 20 years, 50 years, this work is still going, and we're still improving, and we're still measuring it, and hopefully showing improvement. And then one final thing is back to interim milestones. This equity work is really hard. If it was easy, it would have been done years ago. And so you can think about it like a tanker being turned around. And so it's going to take a long time for it to turn around, but you have to show short-term wins, quick wins to say, this work is going to be 10, 20 years, but we don't politically have 10, 20 years. So you have to show in 6 months, in 3 months, every quarter, this is what's working. And then this is why we do this. And this is why we're better off. This is why it fits within our, whatever your institution's missions are. This is fitting with our mission. And that's why you need to keep continuing to do the work.
Jeff, if I could just pile on to something Benga said about short wins and internal communications. Like if I've made any mistake in the work that we've been doing over the past three years to institutionalize this work. It's forgetting to claim the small wins, and forgetting to continue to remind our internal stakeholders, our staff, why this is important, what's been accomplished, and how we move the needle. Because when sometimes you're on a moving train, you don't know how far you've gone, and you assume you're still in the station. And so that conversation about, and that constant conversation about why we're doing this, how we all benefit, and where we're going is I think is critically important. And I think we don't do it enough in a lot of us don't do it enough in much of our work. And I think we don't do it enough in this space specifically.
One of the things that you talked about, stakeholder management, Banga, which I think is really important. And Teresa, that was actually, you talked about acknowledging the wins and stakeholder management in terms of making sure people know when things actually work. I mean, then it's not oh, woe is me. I want to ask you about partners. In the D&I and inclusive journey, how important is it to have partners who are willing to stand alongside you and be accountable for the same thing?
It is crucial, because the thing about this work, and so I'm in the rural development mission area, and there's 8 other mission areas at USDA, and we're doing a lot of this equity work from the executive orders. And a lot of times when you do this work, you don't know if you're on the right track, or you don't know how far you've gone. And so when you're by yourself doing this work, it's a struggle. So when you have partners with this, then they say, you can talk about best practices, you can talk about issues, and it's just kind of that community. Going back to Teresa's point about peer groups, and just to having that community to kind of help you keep you going. It's almost like running a marathon. You're at mile 3 and you're all excited, but you realize I still have 23 miles to go. But when you're running with a running partner, they can keep you up. So at mile 15, at mile 18, when you're dragging, they're like, you got it, keep going. And so, just almost like support is important. But then also, they're going to know stuff that you don't know, that they're going to help you out with. And you're going to know stuff that they won't know. And so there's going to be that peer learning, that social learning that's going to help actually make the product, make things better, make that equity work better and stronger. And so partners are, vital in doing this work.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think finding partners, unconventional partners, is incredibly important as well. Finding those partnerships in the private sector, in academia, libraries, wherever you can find partners to bring into this work. We've been shocked at the value that people who just simply have not been engaged in community and economic development bring to the conversation, because they ask questions that we just assume are gospel, and force us to kind of rethink our approach. And I think, and that's the power of systems. Systems convince you that, oh, things are working the way that they have to work, or they need to work, or they've always worked. And so bringing in some unconventional partners into some of the peer learning and the capacity building that we've done around these issues has been really critical in helping us understand where our blinders are, because we all have them, and having the opportunity to kind of look at things with a fresh eye and ask those critical questions that help us to address these challenges, I think has been really important to our work. So find partners in unconventional places.
I actually want to spend some time asking the members who participate in this plenary to actually ask, if you guys don't mind, some questions. So the chat's going to be open. Folks are going to have a chance to, but we would be remiss, given how terrific these panelists are, we would be remiss if we didn't give people an opportunity to engage with them. So let's take a few minutes to have people who are in our in this group ask questions. You can just in the chat, I think, because I see a bunch of chat messages, mostly saying hello to each other. So I know you can communicate with that. So why don't we just take some questions and put them in the chat, and we'll give people a second to do that. Okay, first question. Maine, where I live and work, is, I can't see the, let's see if I can't see the whole question. um, where I live and work is one. What are the outcomes we should be setting for ourselves in these places? Do you have recommendations for different ways to approach this work in places? For some reason, I can't read the whole question, but you guys get the general thing. Rural
So I think
places.
I have it pulled. I think I have it pulled up. Do you have recommendations for different ways to approach this work in places that have historically excluded, discouraged BIPOC residents?
Yes. Okay. Either
That is
one of you can take it.
that's a great question. And I think a lot of it might be one thing that we haven't talked about is history. And so I'm at USDA and we have a long sad history of inequity that was actually, baked into a lot of our policies, processes, and programs. And so there needs to be an acknowledgement of that, and then to say, okay, this is, sometimes it might mean restitution, sometimes it might be just, having kind of just a session of the community come together and say, this is what we've done in the past that's been harmful, and we acknowledge that, and we're going to do better. And so a lot of times it's like you want to create the environment to make your community inviting, but to do that you have to recognize how you made it that wasn't inviting before, so that it's and then what that can do is that not only is it make your community inviting, but it also serves as a model for other places. So like I talked before that, we do investment in rural places centering equity. We could serve as a model to urban and suburban places. Same thing with your community. If your community has been, hostile, then you say, okay, this is what we've done, and this is what we're doing now to prevent that. And we've been one where we haven't mentioned is being intentional about equity, intentional about investment, being intentional about these things and aware of it, so that they say, okay, this is a place that it is going to be inviting. Because there's always going to be opportunities. Like a lot of these places are great places to live, but we just don't know about it. We don't celebrate it. So once you do these things, people are going to come. But as long as you be able to kind of talk about, this is what our past was, and this is how we're going to be better in the future, then it's going, people will come.
Yeah, I think this is a great question, and I don't want to be too simplistic in my response, but sometimes allyship is calling the question and admitting that you don't have the answer either, and so in I'll be candid with you. I've always lived in very diverse places, and so I don't want to minimize how hard it might be to step forward and to point out. I think the question very clearly said it's the places that have historically excluded or discouraged BIPOC residents. Call that, being an ally means calling that question, finding a space to call that question, acknowledging that you don't have the answers, and that this is not necessarily this is not about an individual's actions or activities, but what is it about this place and the interaction of the policies in this place that are creating this, and start off with something as easy as doing a reading together. There's so many, I think, just compelling and provocative books that can help a community begin a conversation about what has happened here and how did we start here. And I think it just sometimes starts with that small step of calling the question, acknowledging that we don't have all the answers, and then finding shared ways to build that knowledge and understanding. So I think it's a great question. It's not an easy problem to solve, but I think there are just so many opportunities to build a small community of folks who are wondering the same thing as you and committed to making a difference and a change.
Okay. Let's see. I don't see any questions, Eileen, unless you see some to ask. I'll ask this question in the meantime, which is some of the acknowledgement that a community had a history of inequity gets to be a little emotional. How do you make sure you stick to the facts and get out of the emotional business and just get to, this is the history, here's what happened, and now we all agree we're going to do something about it, as opposed to we're going to spend a whole bunch of time re-adjudicating the past. So how do you deal with that? It's a really sensitive I think can be a sensitive matter. How do you get to, let's really talk about the facts?
I think so. So one, this is really hard work, and
Yeah.
this is not easy. It's emotional and sensitive, and I think what there needs to be space for everyone to be able to talk. And so a lot of times um, you just have a session of say, okay, this evening is just going to be talking about these things before we get to facts, before we start talking about things, like just talk about these issues and just have a space for that before you get to the next step. And so, and the thing is, we don't need to get to the end quickly.
Right.
The pace is whatever works for the community. So this may be a long-term thing, or you may be able to get through it quickly, but it's about, and again, like I mentioned before, is that there's no finish line. So it's just about having having the space for everyone to talk and to be free and to have, trust in terms of like, we're our goal is to get to the right place. And however long it takes, that's how long it takes. And so giving
Mm-hmm.
people the space to feel, to grieve, to be emotional. Some people they may not want to partake in it, and that's fine. There's other people who are going to jump right in. And so just giving people the space to do this as for what works for them.
It's interesting. I'm comparing your answer to something Teresa said earlier, which is if you can really get to, here's some actions that we want to take, and you can acknowledge success or success or failure as you go, just progress. That really is part of the journey. At least that's what I'm just recounting what I heard the two of you say together, which in effect, you should have a North Star, but the North Star is not going to be accomplished in like 5 seconds. It's going to take time, and how you get momentum is acknowledging when things work
Yeah.
and getting people together and giving people space. So I hear you both. I'm just comparing the notes that I'm hearing. I hear you both talk about that, and it seems like that's a pretty compelling way to think about this. Is it's not, the victory will not be won all at once. It wasn't lost all at once, and you've got to give people space to emote or not emote depending upon what their need is. That's what I think I hear you both saying, and it sounds more than appropriate. I'm going to go to Eileen and see if there are other questions from the audience.
Okay, I think this is a good one, and it's probably for Teresa. But taking the time to be intentional about DEI commitments can be challenging for small organizations with limited staff who are already overworked. So what would you recommend for those small groups who really want to take on this work, who want to move the ball moving in the right direction and don't even know where to start?
So that is a good question. I mean, for small organizations with limited capacity, I think it is very difficult to find the resources and the time to focus on these issues. I would say a couple of things. And again, I am a huge advocate for reading and discussion. And so to the extent that you want to start a conversation with your staff around issues that are related to the core work that you're doing or just history, I always encourage that. I would say don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to solve every problem in society. There are certain things that are within our purview and our ability, and we need to focus and have some impact in that space before we can move on to the next. And so if your issue or your challenge that you want to really focus on is kind of internal staffing, and you want to think about, what have been the barriers, why haven't we had diverse, staff or people from different communities reflected in our staff. Focus on that challenge. Look at your organization, where your talent pipelines have come from, how you've advertised your position, what kind of hiring panels you put together. There are small things that you can do simply by looking at what's the problem you want to solve. who are the partners that you can kind of bring in to help you identify what the barriers are and what some potential solutions might be. But don't try to boil the ocean. Don't try to fix your organization and the world at the same time. You need to focus on what you can accomplish, and make it a mutual project. Don't as the ED, you don't have to own everything. It's great to have senior leadership driving things, but making certain that this is a team effort, and that folks are, if not fully on board, that they are at least supporting the effort as you move forward. So those are just a couple of things that I would share.
Open that up to Jeff or Bengay.
Teresa had a great answer. There's nothing more to add. The big thing is just like, figure out what you want to do for your own organization, figure out what fits within your mission. And so that way you're able to institutionalize it. So that's not extra work. It's not like, oh, there's what we do, and then there's the DEI stuff. Have that be part of what you do, so that it becomes easier, and it's an everyday thing, and to the point where you don't think about it. That, oh, we need to change how we, if you do only online, there's people who are not always online, especially in rural places. So you do different types of like newsletters or paper, or find something else. And then after a year, that just becomes a part of your outreach. And so it's not something extra, but it's part of how you do your business.
And Eileen, I would just add one additional thing, and again, that what Banga said is that's how you institutionalize the work. But allyship is not just to me, it's not just about individuals; it's about organizations as well. And as a small organization that's trying to cover the entire landscape of this complex work that we do, there's another organization that probably looks just like you, but in a different community that is struggling with the same problems and challenges. Being an ally with an organization that is from a different background of yours, that can be a really powerful learning experience. And so making your own kind of peer network where you can be in allyship with another organization, I think it's an undervalued and an underutilized strategy, because you will learn a lot from one another, from the challenges that you are facing and the solutions that you implement.
Yeah, it's interesting. The reason I asked the partnership question earlier, I think that is the key. All of us want to go this alone because all of us are feeling that we need to do something to make things change, and we're sick of it. But the facts are, you can always do something better with more people, particularly if the people have the same interest in mind as you do. So I think the partnership question looms large. And being able to network looms large too. So you absolutely nailed this. And sometimes there are folks that want to be your partner that you actually have to have the courage to say, I've done my due diligence. You actually don't want to be, you're not committed to this like I am. And sometimes having that discussion early on is better than partnering up and then discovering 24 months later, you didn't get all the things done you really wanted to get done because you didn't really have the same motivations ahead of time. So I think this whole thing about choosing partners is so important, and vetting partners, not just choosing, vetting partners is so important. And I say the same thing for workforce. If people fundamentally don't really at their core care about this work, even if they're supremely talented, you actually don't want them on your team. If they really don't want to see a more equitable America, but they're really good modeling people, then you actually don't hire them, and you go get somebody who really cares. I think those kinds of things where you can get more accomplished in the long run if all of you are actually going in the same direction. And the more time you have to spend reconciling, the worse it gets. So I think it really is look for those partners, and they could be other geographies, they could be in your same geography, it could be other agencies, but looking for partners that really care is part of getting this right, and partners who are willing to be accountable, because care, in my view, is accountability.
So I'm going to because you invited me back, I'm going to put a question to you, Jeff, because you said you were going to ask it and you didn't. So I'm going to put it out to you. So do communities, companies, governments need to establish new approaches so they can be fair moving forward? Or do we also need to look back and make up for past wrongs and generate equity today?
This is the most fired up. If you really want to get people's juices going on diversity, equity, and inclusion, then tie together what happened in the past to what's going on now. So this is dangerous. Probably the reason why I want to ask the question, to be provocative, that all of us need to wrestle with this. So I would say this really gets to what you're willing to be intentional about. So if you're willing to be intentional about going forward, and you want knowledge of what happened in the past, but you're going to intentionally not do anything else, I think it's better for us all to know that and for you to have made that decision than not. So I think that the first thing is, what is it that you really want? Do you want equity in the current, or do you want equality over the time? And I think that really, those are questions organizations need to ask. At our firm, we really are thinking about not just making it fair going forward, but how do we make up some of what happened in the past? Because things like zoning laws and intentionally writing things that were racially discriminatory deeds, I mean, there are a whole bunch of things that happened in the past that influence housing patterns today. We are interested in being intentional about how we can help right some of that. Now, we individually as a company, we can't right all those wrongs. There's no way we could do that. We can't get people better jobs or better schools or all those things that frankly resulted from the bad housing decisions that got made. We can't do that. But there are things that we can do that maybe we help you a little more with your down payment when you go to buy a house if you were historically discriminated against. Maybe we do that. And that's our way of making up some of what happened. And intentionally, we say, we want to make sure that your income, if you're current, gets counted in the right way. That means if it's rental income or any other income, we want to make sure it all gets counted so the system is fair for you going forward. So we're intentional about both. Right? We want to make sure that we live in an environment where it's fair and square for everyone going forward, but also acknowledging the fact that there are things that happened in the past, and where you have an opportunity to deal with them, you deal with them. We actually ask our employees to read 2 books that actually help you on this journey. The first book is The Color Law by Richard Rothstein. Anybody who's not read that book, it is for anybody in any community. You got to read that because it will help you understand how we got to where we're at. But it's not just that, it's the lessons that you're taught from that. And if you plan on trying to make what was unequal equal, it gives you a pathway to do that. So I'd say that. The second book is Evicted by Matthew Desmond, and it really deals with renting in America. And it tells a story, and frankly, I'll admit that I was in tears the whole time I'm reading it, but nonetheless, it tells the story in a way that, I don't care if it's urban or rural, what's going on, it's the renter's path. And if you're going to solve the renter's path in the future, you need to understand that past. But I think intentionality is the common thing. What are you intentional about? Is it, do I want to make sure it's fair going forward, or is it back, or both? And you need to make your decision and stick with it. That's my view.
Eileen, I think Jeff's comments were elegant and perfect, and I would just kind of link it to, there's a question in the chat about how do you discuss these issues with audiences that are too focused on what they might lose rather than what we all can gain. I think that this conversation becomes scary and or political in ways that it does not need to be if we focus on what we all have to gain by addressing just the issues that Jeff laid out. This is not about taking something away from someone else because of past historical injustices. This is about seeing how we can better grow the pie. The San Francisco Fed has done some work where they estimated that we could add $2.6 trillion to our GDP if we just close the labor disparities that exist in our country. Like that's That's real money. If we just had equity with our small businesses, that's real money that's out in the economy. This is not about taking away from one to give to another. This is to make up for past historical things. This is really about strengthening our economy to go for the future and going forward.
So I just wanted to mention real quickly that at USDA, we've established an equity commission to basically address this issue. And one of the things in terms of like trying to establish this, one of the difficulties that we had is that, as I mentioned before, there are 9 mission areas across USDA, and there's so many issues across the different mission areas. How do we where we're actually trying to boil the ocean because there's so many issues? So what we actually set up was a kind of an equity commission to kind of overview and then set up different subcommittees with different focuses. So the first one is going to be on agriculture subcommittee because there's tons of issues and tons of studies about what's happened to, farmers of color, what they've done. Then we're going to set up another one in about like 6 to 9 months that's going to focus on rural community and economic development because there's been a lot of issues there. And so the reason why we're doing that is because to understand where we are now, as Jeff mentioned, we have to know how we got here and then kind of like the structures that were created that created these, as you mentioned before, Eileen, at the top, the system is not broken. The system works. So how do we change the system? Well, we need to understand how we got the system. So once we understand that, then we say, okay, this is how we change the system. This is how we alter the system so that the results that we get aren't the same as we see today. And so you can't you can't sit there and say, okay, we're going to have equality from here on out. Because if you do that, you're keeping the system in place. And you're going to keep those disparities in place. And so that's why you have to do both together. But it is hard. It is difficult. And as Teresa mentioned, people are going to say, well, you're going to take away from me. But we have to kind of understand it's like, no, you are going to benefit too when we close these disparities. You are going to be better off when we include everybody in.
I think with that, Eileen, looks like it's probably time to wrap up.
Yeah, I think we have to give David back the floor and let him wrap us up for the day.
Yeah.
So thank you for including me. It was such an honor. This was an amazing panel. Thank you so much.
And I can't, Teresa and Banga, thank you so much. I really appreciate you giving me an opportunity to interview you and be part of this panel. And David and Eileen, thank you for inviting me. I really appreciate it.
Extraordinary pleasure. Thank you, Jeff. Eileen, panelists, that was a powerful and I'd say necessary conversations. Just a few takeaways for me. I hope maybe they'll mirror your notes. Let's get all this stuff to continue to be part of the conversation. Clearly, the point that the system is designated to get the results it now gets. Establish the space to regularly challenge what we know and the way we work. 2, the work is never done. We have to measure, critique our outcomes, celebrate even the small wins, institutionalize this work for DEI with KPIs, repeated outreach, and in-reach to the staffs and colleagues we have around us. And thirdly, although there were probably a host more points, but to summarize, that a diverse and equitable and inclusive America would have a more equitable geography with special attention to the extractive industries and practices, not allowing businesses and institutions to find rural resources and carry them away, that there is truly a place in this conversation for the geographic diversity that Jeff opened the conversation to discuss. So to conclude for that panel is extraordinarily hard, but it got the sense across that locking vast swaths of our society out of quality homes and denying people shelter is holding back our economy. So working in affordable housing, especially for those of us who focus on persistent poverty areas, is working to correct the injustices we've talked about today. There's so much more we all need to do to ensure our work is equitable, both in how we do it and who benefits from it. It gives me immense hope to see that there were over 100 people viewing the panel on this topic at 5 p.m. after a long conference day on a Wednesday. I mean, it's just an extraordinary commitment by the community of folks who work in rural housing to push ourselves and to better understand the context in which we want to work. This goes from groups at the local level all the way up to the federal level, all working on building racial equity both into their organizations and our commitments to the wider community. And we can easily connect this to the conversations we had earlier with the new administration. They talked about how strengthening our communities into being a more equitable, that federal programs can contribute to this, and thinking that part of the solution to both of those questions is giving community members a real seat at the table and understanding that you need to serve people where they are. For us, we have a great example, I'd say. Recently at HAC, we've been working with the National Endowment for the Arts on a program called the Citizens Institute on Rural Design, or we call it CIRD for shorthand. CIRD communities are identified to host local design workshops where community members weigh in and lead on the solutions to their community's challenges. And the communities in which we have worked have been the Baptist Church in Athens, Ohio, or we were with members of Pueblo Laguna designing an 80,000 square foot market space recently. It's going to be an anchor for their Main Street and a catalyst for revitalization. And it's happening in a way that was lifting local history and reflecting the values of the Pueblo. Secretary Vilsack also took us to a conversation, I think, for all of us who are really deeply within housing, suggesting that for government to remember that we do think about it being more than housing. Groups that come to this conference are deeply connected to every other part of the community. And when he mentioned that you have to have an economy that's working, people are going to be able to afford decent homes, only then, partly he is challenging us to look beyond our silos. Yes, we want him to come to this conference and talk housing, but if our goal is a prosperous rural community, then we have to take on that responsibility of reaching to the others who are around us, including their voices and listening to the progress that they can help us make. So I look forward to seeing you tomorrow. Thanks for attending day one of the National Rural Housing Conference. Thanks for keeping the energy levels up for remarkably high attendance at every single one of the panels. I hope to see you tomorrow again, rejuvenated, recaffeinated. We've got an exciting schedule. We're going to hear from Chairwoman Maxine Waters, House Whip Jim Clyburn. We're extraordinarily honored to host the Reverend Dr. William Barber, who will be keynoting a plenary session on poverty and equity in the afternoon. Plus, guess what? We've got a whole host of workshops covering topics ranging from tribal housing to 502 loan packaging. And in the afternoon, we'll be hosting a networking event where I hope you're collecting those names and those contacts now, because now that will be the best opportunity to be able to reach out in Conference Central and connect with the people who can help you throughout the year. It all kicks off tomorrow at 11 a.m. Eastern, 8 a.m. Pacific to our friends out west. I look forward to seeing you tomorrow.